Yeah, I'm really happy to be here. Honored that Yasmin reached out to invite me to speak. I'm super interested in this topic, intersectionality, and something I'm pretty passionate about. So I'm really happy to be able to share and hopefully get you all excited about it too. One of the reasons why I think it's important that we talk about this term, this kind of trendy educational jargon that's in our discourse now, is because well, I hope to show that it can be very helpful for us for our goals in creating culturally relevant classrooms and safe spaces and embracing our students' full identities and creating sense of belonging. But also there is a narrative about this term in our community of great concern. So some in our community are very concerned about this as a slippery slope, like the title indicates, towards and I'm just going to say it, critical race theory. So this presentation grew out of out of the Equitable Classrooms Working Group. I was working with a breakout group on a presentation for Faculty Development Week about this term, intersectionality. It's something that came up in some of our readings with the Equity Working Group. And so we wanted to dive into it a little bit deeper, and we studied the term together as a group, and we're presenting for Faculty Development Week. And I think it's important to share at the outset of my presentation that we were approached by someone in our, from the EPCC community about the topic, who was very concerned and said, this is a slippery slope to critical race theory, which, this person was very concerned about, and felt that our presentation was inappropriate. Unfortunately, we didn't get into a discourse or a conversation with this person, and so we weren't able to, really talk out the issue. But I just want to put it out there that, yeah, some folks in our community are very concerned about this, and concerned about the potential links to critical race theory. And I guess I hope to offer enough information for you all today, the participants here, and resources so that you have a good understanding of the origins of the term and the meaning that was intended behind the concept when it was created, so that you are sort of armed with more information to go out into your respective discourses and maybe mitigate some misinformation. And of course, to decide for yourself whether or not you think this is a good topic to talk about with students, and whether it's a useful concept for us at EPCC. So the image that I have here, I'll come back to, and I'll give you, thank you, Elizabeth, linked to this. There's a great website with the University of Michigan, where if you want to dive into this tool, this social identity wheel as a tool, there's tons of information about how to use this with students. Today, I'm not going to be talking about how to necessarily use this with students, but more as a reflective practice for instructors, for faculty, for us, as the people creating the environment where learning is taking place, as the people who are creating the spaces that our students are coming into to learn. I want to encourage a self-reflective process on our side that has less to do with what we're actually, asking the students to do, what assignments we're giving, what we're doing, sort of putting out towards the students, but how we're reflecting inward on our side. So the main takeaway that I hope that you'll gain from my talking today is an inspiration to actually go and read the article by Kimberly Crenshaw, where this term intersectionality first sort of popped up. in academia. She is a scholar of law, not an education particular, but so the term began in this discourse about law and has migrated into the educational discourse. So Kimberly Crenshaw's article, thank you, Elizabeth, yay. It's available on JSTOR. It is quite long, it's 60 pages, but I hope that you'll feel inspired to, plow through it at some point. I know everyone is quite busy, but I advocate for it as a kind of a foundational text for us and those of us, in this community of equity, justice, and inclusion. Now that it's part of our educational discourse, that I feel that this is a pretty foundational text for us to all have, in common. So I hope that you'll read the actual article at some point soon. But I am going to go through some of the main points of the article, and then I'll switch gears and talk about how it has been expanded into education, and then give a little example of how I've been using it. Not so much in my classroom, although I have started to bring it into my classroom in terms of my conversations with students, but more in terms of how I've been using it as a self-reflective process for myself. So the title of the article, the key article, the foundational text that I hope you all read soon is called Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color. And I guess I'll stop right here and just say that I will be speaking about some examples in the article that have to do with sexual assault and rape. So in terms of a content warning, if you have, need to step away, or anything starts to feel a bit triggering for you personally, please, take care of yourself, and feel free to step away and come back whenever you're ready. So the main kind of point of the article is that Kimberly Crenshaw is pointing out that the experiences of Black women have been marginalized within, here it says anti-violence context, it should say anti-violence and anti-racism context. So discourses of care, of healing, of reparations around sexual assault and violence, and also discourses of care, of healing, of reparations around anti-racism. So both of these conversations, she wants to point out, have marginalized Black women, and the reason for that is because of a failure to recognize the intersections of those identities, among others. So the key takeaway is that the social power in delineating difference need not be the power of domination. It can instead be the source of social empowerment and reconstruction. So the person who reached out to us, to my group in Faculty Development Week, and said, I'm really uncomfortable with this topic, I don't think you should be talking about it, this person was very concerned about identity politics, that identity politics were being brought into the classroom in a way that was potentially disruptive, destructive, divisive. And so I think that the main takeaway from the article is that there's another way of looking at identity politics, and that actually the opposite is quite true. So let's talk about some of just the main sections of the article. The first section that I'll just touch on briefly has to do with a field study that the author completed in what are, at least at that time, called battered women's shelters. So services to provide care for women who've suffered from domestic violence. And she visited 3 shelters over a period of time in Los Angeles, and this was in the 90s. And one shelter served primarily Black women, the Genesee Battered Women's Shelter. One served primarily Asian women, the Every Women's Shelter, and one served primarily Latina women, the La Casa Shelter. So, but she saw some trends across her experiences in these centers for service, and she saw that what was happening was that the standards of need for the clients were being framed in terms of a white middle class idea of need. So she saw a lot of failure and frustration and burnout among counselors who were, not able to effectively meet the needs of the people coming into the shelters. And she saw she saw people who needed care whose needs were not being met because of a failure to see the intersectional, the ways that social identities were intersecting for those people. So for example, the people running these shelters were not adequately aware of how both a language barrier and intergenerational family households for immigrant women were contributing to were barriers to their ability to seek out care. So there was a failure to see that intersectional complexity because the standards of need were being framed in terms of a white middle class idea. So the second interesting context that she looks at is, and again, I'm going to be referencing a particular case, a particular rape case, because it will come back in the third context actually. But she looks at, in the legal system, the way that the racialized identity of victims of sexual assault and domestic violence determined a lot about how the abuse was characterized and how much attention the cases received. So the Central Park jogger case is a case of a white female who was sexually assaulted in Central Park, and it at the time garnered a huge amount of public attention. Fun factoid is that actually Donald Trump at the time, $1,000 full-page ad in the New York Times called. Oh, sorry. Is there a question? Oh, no. Okay. So I just want to double check my facts here, but an $85,000 full-page ad in the New York Times referring to this case, which said simply, "Bring back the death penalty, bring back our police." So there was quite a bit of media coverage of this particular case. While Kimberly Crenshaw points out there were several other equally horrific sexual assault cases that had occurred in the same geographic region, but those cases were of women of color, and those were not being talked about in the media or in law enforcement. So her point is that the legal system's primary concern is with protecting white women from Black men. And she goes back to, our history after Reconstruction with the narratives around lynching and points out that, again, women of color are being left out of the conversation, even though it's ostensibly a conversation about preventing domestic violence, preventing sexual assault. Black women are left out of the conversation. And then the third context that is really fascinating that she brings up is this this moment of an obscenity charge, so being filed against this hip hop group, Two Live Crew. So Two Live Crew is a hip hop group who were popular in the 90s, and indeed their lyrics are extremely misogynist. So if you want to, take a little deep dive and check out the actual music of Two Live Crew, be my guest, but you will be confronted with pretty extreme misogyny, and that's not to be denied. But the case of these rappers being, arrested and charged with obscenity after a live performance in Florida is an interesting, again, intersection of established patterns of vigilante attitudes about the sexual expression of Black men, and also the dismissal of the artistic value of hip hop. So it's a fascinating controversy. So if you, there's a link here to an article if you want to read more about the actual controversy over the Two Live Crew lyrics. But again, the point is that women of color, the actual victims of this misogyny, are being left out of the conversation. And I will just refer back to the Central Park jogger case briefly, because there was an article in Newsweek written by the reporter George Will at the time, which referenced the Central Park jogger case in particular. And I'll just read briefly from Kimberly Crenshaw's article. George Will writes, "Some members of a particular age and societal cohort, the one making Two Live Crew rich, stomped and raped the jogger to the razor edge of death for the fun of it." End quote. So Crenshaw points out that Will directly indicts Two Live Crew in the Central Park jogger rape case through a fictional dialogue between himself and the defendants. So there was no actual connection between these men, these hip hop artists, Two Live Crew, and their misogynist lyrics and what happened to this white woman in Central Park. But Crenshaw's pointing out that the discourse around these incidents serves to both conjure up these racist attitudes towards the sexual expression of Black men and serve to censor the expression of Black men. And the motivation is to protect an idea of women, which is of a white woman. So Black women are left out again of the conversation. So again, I've done my best to try to touch on some of the main points of the article, but I really encourage you to read it yourself, because it's fascinating, and these are only just 3 touch points in an extremely well-researched and authoritative article. So please read the article at some point if you can. And I guess I'll pause there if there are any questions. Okay. All right. So how do we get from this article about, the double marginalization of Black women in these discourses of anti-violence and anti-racism to our teaching context at El Paso Community College and our goals in creating safe spaces for our students? Well, for one thing, like I said, this word has entered the educational discourse. We read about it in the equity working group. It was touched upon in one of the articles that we read about, and but without any real reference back to the source of the Kimberly Crenshaw's article or the term. And she points out very explicitly that she's not interested in creating a totalizing theory of identity, but just bringing up this idea that identities intersect and that systems have served certain people well and others not as well. And if we don't look at the nuance, we will risk duplicating that marginalization within our discourse, even within our discourse of care, which we are in a discourse of care, of service. We're educating students of color primarily. So we're in a discourse of service. And if we are blind to or fail to recognize our own the way that we are framing that discourse, then we risk further marginalizing the people we're trying to help, right? So this idea has been expanded out to say, okay, so let's not make the same mistake that these, for example, these women these white women running these shelters were making. Let's not make the same mistake that George Will was making in not recognizing the intersections of race and gender when he brought the Central Park jogger case into the Two Live Crew controversy. Let's not make the same mistake. So let's be more aware and reflective of our own social identities. So if you look up social identity wheel or intersectionality wheel, you'll find many different iterations of this, which all attempt to just make the picture fuller and make it more accurate, more complete. So for me, so now I'll switch gears and I'm going to be talking about me personally, which of course is, for every individual is going to be completely different. So if you will indulge me for the next few moments in just hearing a little bit about my personal life and my family, I'll try to give an example of how I'm using this as a reflective tool for myself to continue to grow in my concept of identity. So I know that we're all aware that that we need to embrace our students' identities and that they're in a place of growing in their sense of identity, and equity and diversity and inclusion means making spaces where all of their identities are empowered. And where, they're also aware of where they carry privilege. So if we're going to make those types of spaces, we've got to engage in that process ourselves. So I think sometimes there's a tendency to think that since we've been through college, we've got our degrees, we've got our teaching positions, and we're adults, that we're kind of done, that we're finished, that we're complete in our identity seeking process or our identity development process. And I hope that to challenge that and to invite us to all be on a journey with our students in developing our sense of identity further as the discourses change and the discourses become more nuanced and become more inclusive. So for me, I have my name up here. Sarah Youngblood Squirrel is my government name, the name that I was given at birth with 2 L's. My aunt actually removed one of the L's at some point in her life because she just felt it was unnecessarily. It was one of those things where you change a name slightly to make it more, more Americanized or more anglicized or whatever. But it's a Cherokee name. I was able to several years ago travel to Oklahoma and meet my great uncle Alex Squirrel, and he taught me the Cherokee word for our name, Saloli. So, and then I got married. I married a white male, and his name is Jackiewicz, and that's origin is Polish, and I followed the patriarchal tradition of erasing, moving from my father's name to my husband's name, which, I made that choice at the time and maybe would make a different one now, but in any case, that's the choice I made. So that's a little bit more about my name. The painting that I have here is a painting from my grandmother's house. She unfortunately passed away this summer. I was lucky to have my grandmother, in my life for a long time. And looking at this painting and thinking about my family and where many generations of my family have lived in the South, on my grandmother's side, my grandfather's side, even this is my maternal grandmother and grandfather, and also on my paternal side, many of my ancestors lived in Georgia, Tennessee, South Carolina. So for me, I am currently in my process of, developing my identity, my ideas about my identity. I'm grappling with the idea that, well, some of my ancestors are from, South Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee, my Cherokee ancestors, but who were forcibly removed and who experienced a calculated campaign of cultural assimilation and boarding schools and adoptions on behalf of all of the rest of my ancestors. So the fact that many generations of my family could own homes like the one in this painting in the South, own land, is and the intergenerational wealth that was accumulated through those many generations of home ownership and land ownership. So that is something that I'm newly kind of dealing with the weight of. So when I'm looking at this wheel, I'm looking at the intersection between all of those ancestors living at the top of the racial caste system in the Deep South through the Civil War, even going back to Revolutionary War. I'm learning so much about my how far back my immigration stories actually go, but having really recognizing the fact that that those generations of my ancestors were living and moving around at the top of the racial caste system, able to own homes and work in the middle class society, how that intersects with the socioeconomic status that I currently enjoy, the financial fluidity and financial security that I currently experience, and how that affects the other parts of the wheel for me. So while I'm a female, and we in a patriarchal society have so some aspects of that identity are marginalized, the socioeconomic piece sort of is a palliative. I can always kind of make my way in the world if I can solve my problems with financially. So that's where I am at currently with this. And of course, this has changed a lot for me over the years. I remember when I first really realized that I had to recognize white privilege. So that was maybe 16 years ago so I was about 22 when I actually just really came to the realization that, I have to deal with the white privilege that I carry. So I'm sharing this just as an example of how I've grown, and I'm continuing to grow in this process, looking at my social identities. And of course, like I said, it's going to be very different for everyone. And like Trevor was saying, my lived experience is very, very wildly different from my students in many cases, but also from my colleagues, in terms of how I got to higher education, like the privilege that I enjoyed getting through the door. I mean, I was on skids to get through a master's degree. Like I probably couldn't have avoided it if I wanted to, or at least a bachelor's degree. Like, but for many people, that's just not the case. It's a fight and a overcoming of barriers at every step. So so that's a little about me. I think I will skip this one. These are just a couple of other paintings that I've been looking at and reflecting on from my family collection, in terms of looking at my growth in my awareness of personal identity. But so just to recap, and I put this picture here because I think it's kind of funny, and I just wanted to provide maybe a little comic relief since we're talking about privilege and oppression. And if you look closely, you can see that the chicken is stepping on the dog like a little step stool. So I don't know, it's a funny moment, it's a funny picture, but it does kind of, it shows me in my home that I now own, and it is a reflection of, my social identities and privilege. Able to have pets and chickens and all of that, and have a garden and own a home. Just moving through the main things that I feel are important for me to be constantly aware of as a teacher walking into an educational space with students of color, and also aware, also to, without trying to center myself too much, but make my students aware that I'm aware. If they know that I'm aware of these things, I think that the space will be safer for them. For example, if I can, within context of whatever we're talking about in class, express the fact that I'm aware that I have hetero cisgender female presenting privilege because I, was assigned female at birth, and I always felt, I always identified with that. I think that if my students are aware that I'm aware, they will feel safer. I am still working on Eurocentric ideas about bodies and dance. Yasmin, I see your question and I love it. I'll get to it right quick. So I'm still dealing with Eurocentric ideas about bodies and dance, about thinness, about whiteness. So, looking at teaching ballet is like such an intersection that I constantly have to check myself in terms of my ideas about bodies, ageism. My grandmother is famous for always saying, at church, like, don't put me in that group with the old people. Or she was 80 years old and I went to visit her. Was lucky to see her one of the last times before she passed away, and she was in her 80s, and I was at the old folks home with her, the retirement village, and she was like, Sarah, we've got to go help the old people today, which was just so my grandmother. But there was some subtle ageism there, like not wanting to identify with the older, being identified as old. So I'm I've got to undo that, even though my grandmother was a sweet woman, and I don't want to, right? I don't want to carry that ageism forward, like we can embrace all of the ancestral knowledge that we get from our grandparents and parents and chosen family and everyone, but we can also choose what we carry forward into the future and what we sort of leave behind. So to answer Yasmin, your question, I think the students, it's a fine line of, if they ask, of course, I'm very willing to disclose always if questions come up. And I think one thing that has worked well for me is to share a little bit at the end of a discussion. Like I'll do a lecture, for example, on hip hop and talk about redlining and the start of mass incarceration and the fires and the urban neglect in the Bronx and the racism of the urban renewal projects that were happening that sort of converged to be the foundation where hip hop emerged from. So we'll talk about all that, and then at the end of the lecture, I might say, but I'm a white upper middle class woman. I learned about this in college. I'm not part of this culture. This is something that I learned about from in academia. So I may have made some mistakes. And I actually have started like leaving the room for a little bit, where I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna go outside. You talk amongst yourselves and talk about maybe where I went wrong. Like, did I make a mistake somewhere? Or else just talk, I think that me stepping out, part of being aware of privilege is kind of being aware of what discourses you belong in and where to lean back and step out. So, I don't know if that answers it, but I'm always happy to share stories about myself. So thank you for listening. I will, like I said, I'm going to step out of the, how much time do I have? 10. I wanted to hear from you all and do a little reflection. Oh no, I talked the whole time. Oh my God. I'm really sorry. I did not mean to talk the whole time. I wanted to go back to this and ask you all to maybe do a little bit of writing, journal for a few minutes and share, because these questions inside are really fascinating. Like, which identities do you think about most often? Which do you think about the least often? And these are important questions, because the ones you think about most often might be the ones where you experience the most might be, I'm not saying it is, but it might be the place where you experience the most marginalization. So, for me, I've got like this, if this were a privileged marginalization board game, I'm like racking up the privilege as I go around this wheel, right? But when it comes to gender, that's the one that I feel like, oh, I think about that a lot, like being a woman, right? But the identities that I think about least often are the, until I started doing this process, were the ones where I carried more privilege for me. So I would love to hear, I don't know if there's just a few minutes left, if anybody wants to share, the answers to any of these questions, or talk about how your sense of identity has changed recently. Being biracial, this was very informational and intriguing to me. Yes, because there's so many identities that I feel like especially our marginalized ones, are the ones where we don't have the information. We have to seek it out. We have to ask questions and kind of do more active research. And I think the process of doing that is such great modeling for our students, to say, like, I'm learning more about my Indigenous ancestry, even though I got no information really. I sought it out, and I'm learning more, even though it's difficult. It's difficult to look at, but to help your students have a model of doing that, and embracing their marginalized identities and changing the narrative around the identity. Like, let me just end by going back to Kimberly Crenshaw, saying she acknowledges that these identities are socially constructed, and so they're fluid, but while they may be socially constructed, they're still meaning, because of the narratives around the identities, and the narratives are what we need to focus on changing and making more empowering. So yeah, I'll stop talking now. I didn't mean to talk this long, but if there are any questions, I'll pause and then let the host take over.
Wow, I just have to say wow, because I'm thinking about so many things right now on this wheel, and I'm looking at this article. I have to sign in though. I already clicked on that link there. I'm very interested in the Law Journal article, and I'm really happy that you shared this today. I'm also so I introduced you with the wrong name then, Sarah. So we should change that. That's a really important thing to bring up, is how your identity changes and how your name is integral to that. It's very cool.
Yeah, and I'm not ready to claim that, like that Cherokee name. Like I grew up in a suburb, and I lived my lived experiences of a upper middle class white woman. So I'm not claiming that name. I put it there, and as part of the conversation, because it's part of this process I'm going through. But yeah, it's a different matter to actually say, oh, I'm not about to say that I'm Indigenous, but it's just a matter of recognizing that thread in the whole tapestry, I guess.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful, like, honest accounting of each of these, like a thoughtful and deliberate accounting. I'm really drawn to that idea. It's a very, very great project you're doing. Well, let's do applause then for Sarah. Let's give like emoji applause, and thank you so much.